Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, presented by me, Suzi Fay. I've got a Bloomsbury book bag for a Bloomsbury book. I'll be talking about a novel for the next hour or so, a novel that is very firmly based in real life. It's a true story, the novelisation of the life of the amazing Dora Maar, or to be more precise, the relationship that she had with Picasso. It's an absolutely fascinating novel, and I'm delighted to invite Louisa Treger into the book bag. Welcome, Louisa. Hello.
Hello, Suzi. Thanks so much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I didn't know much about Dora Maar, so the book has really filled in lots of gaps for me. I suppose a lot of people would say, well, Dora Maar, Picasso, oh yeah, she's the weeping woman. I wondered how you first came across Dora Maar.
It was the Tate Modern retrospective of her and her work in 2019, late 2019 and 2020, that first alerted me to her talent. I didn't know much about her at all. And it was particularly her black and white images that grabbed me and just would not let go. Suzi, they are radical, fantastical. She has this gift for imbuing the everyday with uncanniness in a way that is both unsettling, deeply unsettling, but also mesmerizing. And I went to research her. You know, I thought I've got to know more about her. Not only was she a photographer, she was also a painter, a poet, and a radical left-wing activist. And you're absolutely right. Most people know her for being Picasso's weeping woman, his lover and his muse. But I just thought she deserved her own story.
Absolutely. So you tell the story of their relationship in the Paris Muse. I was very interested to see, I've mentioned the beautiful cover where she's sort of peering out and looking at us. It's a self-portrait, isn't it? She took that picture on the cover.
Yes, it's a self-portrait. And the Dora Maar estate gave Bloomsbury permission to use it. And my cover designer has slightly played with the colours in a way that I think works perfectly for a book cover. But the original photo is black and white, so it's even more moody and pensive and mysterious.
She had a relationship with Picasso for about 9 years, and I mean, you make a very good case that she's the most important of the muses, and much more than that. But she had a life before Picasso, which you do talk about as well. I mean, what was she up to the moment that she met Picasso? She wasn't just a nobody until she met him, was she?
She was a celebrated and famous photographer. Before he'd even painted one of his weeping woman portraits, before they knew each other, her work had already been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and also at the 1936 International Surrealist Exhibition in London. So you could say that she was as much a household name of 20th century art for the works she created as for those she inspired. And she met Picasso as an equal. That she seduced him. There's a wonderful apocryphal story which I include in my book, which I'd love to tell you about. She went to his cafe, the Domago, and sat alone at a corner table. He was talking to people across the room. And she waited till his eyes fell on her, till she had his attention. And then she took a knife from her bag and she splayed her fingers on the tabletop and she stabbed the knife between her fingers, her arm coming down from greater and greater heights. And sometimes she missed. And by the time she stopped, her hand was covered in blood. And Picasso was already quite famous when they met. And he had a terrible reputation with women. And she knew she'd have to do something daring and transgressive to capture his attention. And she succeeded perfectly. And I just love that moment because, she's there as his equal. It's Picasso's hands that start shaking, as they start talking. And it says a lot about her because, she was no kind of wholesome girl next door. She was very complex, transgressive, had a dark side, which I think, she and Picasso were attracted by their dark sides as much as by anything else.
She had an affair. Again, I didn't know the story at all, but there was, and there were various encounters with Georges Bataille, and I knew nothing about this, but that definitely, he kind of prepped her for somebody as dark as Picasso and maybe made her more able to cope. Can you talk a little bit about that very strange relationship?
I totally agree with you. So Georges Bataille was a French writer and philosopher. And he was known for being deeply kinky. And in fact, when Dora met him, he was showing people his collection of pornography, totally without embarrassment. And they were very attracted to one another. And he absolutely gave her an education in, kinky relationships, kinky sex. He was unfaithful to Dora. And I totally agree with you. He got her ready for the relationship with Picasso. And Picasso, of course, was fascinated by the fact that they'd been together. Sort of said, what did you do with him?
And she'd already, well, you mentioned that she was in the Surrealist exhibition. She'd created some quite disturbing artworks by this time in her photography. And she was very inventive in her use of photography, wasn't she? You go into this a little bit in the book.
Yes, she was groundbreaking. She was experimental, and she, pushed the limits with all sorts of experimental techniques like photomontage, which is where you cut up images and superimpose them and then, develop the print again so that it comes out as a seamless physical print. And she did quite erotic, disturbing work using that technique. For example, one of her images shows a matron in those half-moon spectacles riding a man in a bowler hat in a very formal living room. And under the table, there's a little boy watching this scene transfixed. And actually, she took the image of the little boy, she'd photographed him in Barcelona. She did a lot of street photography, but she took that little boy and superimposed him, into this sort of erotic scene. And the result is most disturbing and powerful.
Can I ask you a little bit about the research that you did? I mean, when you went to this exhibition, so I'm mindful that this is before COVID hit.
Yes,
was this
yes.
a novel that was written during that period? And were you looking for your next subject, or did they just drop in your lap when the time is right?
I was writing another novel during COVID, but Dora was simmering in my mind the whole time. The idea of her just, turning thoughts over. And it was when I'd finished that novel that I really thought I've got to write this story of Dora Maar. I've got to give her her dues, because I think a lot of writers feel like this, but when there's an idea really niggling away that just won't let go of you, you've got to write it.
Absolutely. So in research, what I get the impression from reading this book that you don't cheat, put it that way. It's a novel. You have to find your way to novelize, but I really get the very strong impression that you are working from facts. So
Yeah.
how do you novelize a story like this?
Well, I took the biographical framework as my sort of skeleton. And what I really love about biographical fiction is it gives me access to the emotional depths of my characters. It allows me to bring to life the historical feelings as well as the facts. And it, this novel is true to the facts. Occasionally, there were gaps in the record. For example, Dora couldn't fall pregnant, which was a source of great grief and distress. But there's no evidence about why she couldn't fall pregnant. If she had a medical condition or something, I couldn't find it. And in the absence of facts, I felt free to construct a narrative around this part of her life.
Right. So if the facts are not there, you can surmise, but if the facts are there,
Exactly.
you stick to them.
I stick to them while sort of colouring in, the emotional layers.
So how did you fill her out as a personality? I mean, we've said she's transgressive. There's a dark side to her. But you have to have quite a wide palette, it seems to me, to have a whole novel about somebody. So talk about some of the elements in her character that appealed to you and helped you in writing the book.
Oh, of course. And I just want to say first that, I totally immersed myself in her life. I kind of lived with her art. I looked at it every day. I read her letters, her poems, and until you really feel very close to her because she lived in my head for so long. She was so complex, and that appealed to me. I mean, she was fiercely intellectual. I think she was the only one of Picasso's lovers who could really hold her own intellectually with him, which he loved. I mean, she was radical. She was involved with left-wing politics, signed manifestos, went on marches, and this was in the 1930s. And women didn't get the vote in France until 1944. So I think that, gives you an idea of how unusual she was. She was incredibly chic. She had her own style. She was a great conversationalist. I mean, she was extraordinarily talented, passionate, and, really, if she had a conviction or a belief, she really stuck to it. There was just so much in her to admire. And, and I had a great time trying to bring out all those different facets of her character. And of course, she was neurotic, highly strung, transgressive, and that only made her more interesting.
And she was also, before even meeting Picasso, very cosmopolitan. I mean, she'd grown up in Buenos Aires, for example. Her father was he Croatian? Right. So she's an intriguing mixture already, isn't she?
I totally agree. Her mother was French and her father was a Croatian architect who took the family to Buenos Aires to make his fortune, which never really happened. And that's another story. But yes, this incredibly cosmopolitan background. She spoke Spanish fluently, which is another thing Picasso loved. It made him feel like there were soulmates, and she had a breadth of outlook that comes from, living in different countries.
One thing I love about the book, I mean, given that it's about two absolutely extraordinary characters, I mean, you focus on Dora, but Picasso's always there hovering in the background, or he's like the Minotaur, isn't he? He's like this in the background.
You can't get away from Picasso. He's exactly. Such a strong character.
Well, that's interesting in itself that you fictionalize him and it's a totally believable portrait. But what I found really amazing about the book, and what I think is the core of its appeal, is that really it's about asymmetric relationships. So, we don't all go out with somebody like Picasso, but I think many people will have had that feeling of, I love that person just a bit more than they love me, and that gives them power over me. In the case of Dora and Picasso, that is magnified 100-fold. But the basic, I'm enthralled to this person is kind of something I think people will relate to.
I think so. I mean, I've had a relationship like that. I think many people have, and I hope lots of people relate to that. And one of the things that was so interesting to write was that, in the beginning, when Dora was playing the knife game, she held the power, and then gradually she lost it, and eventually it broke her.
Yeah, it kind of ebbed away, but it's such an interesting dynamic that you love the person, but you kind of hate what they're doing to you, and you hate that you can't escape. And
yes.
I mean,
and you
try.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, I was shouting at her. I was wanting to shake her, but not being able to break with them, although she did try several times. And of course, World War II made it more difficult for her to be by herself because the Nazis occupied France, and to be a woman on your own. And she was actually born Theodora Markovitch. She had a Jewish sounding surname. And she just, she felt too unsafe to lead an independent life. She needed Picasso. Well, she needed him. He was like the sun to her, but she also needed the protection he could offer her.
I think that he needed her to an extent during that period, because the wartime period of the book I just found completely fascinating, because I had not associated it with Picasso. I think when I think about Picasso, I think about the old man Picasso in the Breton sweatshirt, doing that amazing drawing with a torch. And, he's so at ease in the south of France. He's still a powerful, amazing person, but he's sort of diminished in Paris in wartime. He's not the potent figure. And I think Dora helped him. There was sort of a symbiosis, wasn't there, at that point?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I went down 1,000 rabbit holes when I was researching, Paris under the occupation. It's just the most fascinating and multi-layered subject. And of course, so different to, the experience of the UK in the war, because we were never occupied. But Picasso was considered a degenerate by the Nazis. And there was this strange sort of balance, because on the one hand, there would have been an international outcry if they'd actually harmed Picasso. But on the other hand, they kept a very strict eye on him, and he wasn't allowed to exhibit his, I think he was quite worried about what he could paint without getting into trouble. And he and Dora folded into each other for comfort, that he couldn't travel, he didn't meet lots of other women. So although there were lots of hardship, freezing cold, not enough food, they were scared. But it was a time of relative calm in their relationship, paradoxically.
Yes, as you've said, they became sort of, it was always an intense relationship, but you paint this extraordinary picture of, to a certain extent, life going on in Paris for creative people, but they just had to sort of keep a bit under the radar. But they're still going out, they're still enjoying themselves as much as they can, they're still having the odd drink. what about the sort of streets of Paris? Did you kind of wander around and get a feel for their neighborhood and all of that?
So I had a lovely holiday with my children 2 years ago where we followed Picasso and Dora's trail, first in Paris, and absolutely, as you said, getting to know their neighborhood, getting to know how far away their apartments were for each other, walking along the Seine. And seeing it in all its different moods and guises. One day the water kind of grey and choppy, and the next day sparkling in the sunlight. And we went to their cafe. So we really, it's just soaked up the atmosphere of the city and how their world fitted together. And we went to Antibes as well, and went to the Picasso Museum and, lay on the beaches where Picasso and Dora hung out. It was the most wonderful trip, and it brought the book alive for me.
Well, yes, it feels you're sort of living with them as you read the book. I've kind of leapt over, of course, Guernica, a very significant point in both their lives. I mean, we've mentioned Paris under Nazi occupation, but the fact that he had painted something like Guernica must have made him a very suspect person to them, to the Nazis. And of course, Dora, as you say in the book, played such a part in that
Yes.
pinnacle, really, of 20th century art.
So Dora, her political awareness influenced Picasso a great deal, both as a human being and as an artist. And she encouraged the growth of his political awareness, which culminated probably in the painting of Guernica. And Guernica expressed his outrage at the bombing of the Spanish village of the same name in 1937 by German and Italian warplanes. And Dora was absolutely instrumental in the creation of this painting. And I think it's a sort of unacknowledged debt. It's not, he owes her a debt which hasn't been acknowledged by art history. So he asked her to be by his side while he painted. And she took hundreds of black and white photographs of the painting being created, which, has produced both a really important art historical resource, but also proof of their creative partnership. And she encouraged him to forego color in favor of black and white, so that the work takes on the immediacy of the hundreds of prints that, she developed to show him. And he paints the sun with a bare bulb in the center, and it's like an electric eye, like Dora's camera flash. It's recording the scene. And also, according to his biographer, John Richardson, Dora actually painted the flank of the horse in the center of the painting. So she flooded into Guernica. And I think that's what she always wanted, that creative intimacy, that there were creative partners as well as lovers.
It feels like the high point of their relationship in many ways. And it's very hard not to see black and white Guernica against black and white photography. You feel that there's that link there.
You can't escape it, you're right.
And the detail of the painting, which you have in the novel, I thought, wow, incredible, because the other story in the novel is Picasso's absolute single-mindedness about his work, which in the end actually it's sort of better than partners, better than lovers, better than children, better than anything. It's a single-mindedness, and just the idea that he would allow her to pick up a brush I mean, what a wonderful moment that is in art history and in their relationship.
And it is an ultimate moment of trust, I think.
Mm. Mm. Well, as things sort of go on in the novel, their relationship has its ups and its downs, and then sort of goes into quite a slide. No spoilers because it's a well-known story, you know. But other women were always there in a way. That, you know, she becomes aware fairly early on this is not an exclusive relationship, and she has to, with Picasso, you either deal with it or you walk away.
Yes, yes. I have her say in the novel when she's like thinking about his other women and really wondering if she's strong enough to handle it or not. She says something like, you know, I had a feeling that whatever happened between us, it was going to be one of the most important things that had ever happened to me, if not the most important. So I think, you know, she took a risk, but she kind of knew that even if it turned out badly, it would be something incredibly significant in her life.
Mm. Let's talk a little bit about the Picasso circle, because I mean, one of the great things, she gets introduced to his incredible circle of friends. I mean, I find it extraordinary. We have Cocteau, we have Roland Penrose, we have Lee Miller, we have Paul Eluard, and you kind of impersonate them all. At each point, did you sort of have to go off and do more biographical research?
Yes, I
I mean,
did.
you
But
feel
actually,
like we're at the
one of
next
the
cafe table, you know, as we listen to them all.
So one of the big problems of writing this novel was that Picasso had so many friends and so many visitors. I had to cut out quite a few because I think it's much better to kind of do more with less characters. You know, I didn't want it to be like a sort of, you know, all these people passing through, giving them one line and then you never see them again. But it was quite hard to decide which ones to focus on. And yes, I had the most wonderful time, and I did, you know, research all of them and get to know them. There's also Lee Miller, the photographer, and Man Ray, and they all went off to Mougins together to have these incredible summer holidays, which were sort of very intense, you know, all about friendship and creativity. And it actually morphed into bed swapping eventually, which Dora was the only one. She couldn't take part. She was too much in love with Picasso to even contemplate it, you know, but of course he did take part. He had a wonderful time.
Yes, I mean, set against, there's a theme of female friendship. She does have these very strong friendships with women who are having their own problems, like her friend who married Andre Breton. You know, that was not a terribly easy life. So that there's a certain amount of female solidarity, but it makes it all the more breathtaking when you get to the the fun in the sun aspect of bed swapping. The sort of sisterly solidarity seemed to disappear at that point, and it's quite heartbreaking to read about, actually.
Yes. Well, I mean, it was very important to me to have that element of female friendship in the novel because it was, you know, it was sort of light amid the darkness. You don't, you know, you need some light in there. And then, of course, Picasso started to flirt with Dora's friends, and it was absolutely heartbreaking for her because it was that double betrayal.
And there's something about Picasso that he was really he could be very cruel, he could be very unfeeling, but at the same time he couldn't entirely let go. Once you were a Picasso woman, it was sort of for life in a way. I mean,
Totally.
you know, you're in these canvases, you are a muse, and they're all the, you know, the other, so you're there for life, but you are there for life in other ways as well. He wouldn't let you go even if he didn't want you anymore.
No, that's right. I think he felt that once you were his woman, you belonged to him forever.
Mm.
And he was a bit like that with his possessions. So it was obviously part of his personality. Apparently, his, you know, everywhere he lived was sort of piled up to the rafters with clutter. He even kept cigarette packets, you know, and empty chocolate wrappers. He just couldn't let go of anything, and it was as if he felt that to let go of something or someone was like cutting off a part of himself. And, you know, he would phone Dora after he'd left her. He would phone her just to make sure, you know, that she was still aware of him. He didn't want to, he wanted to be at the center of her consciousness, even though he didn't want her anymore.
Yes, it feels like he's sort of tugging on a string or a leash or something to make sure she's still at
Totally.
the other end. Yeah.
Exactly, to make sure she still, you know, twitches to those strings when he pulls.
Mm. Was there any sort of further collaboration, or was it more that once it was over, and he moved on? I mean, the next lady in line, and they get younger and younger, of course, is Francois Gillot.
Francois Gillot, that's right.
Yeah. So you dramatize that moment as well, when, you know, he falls in love with this now kind of impossibly young woman who could, unlike Dora, give him children, including, here's my show and tell, my bottle of lovely perfume by Paloma Picasso, who I believe Francois Gillot was her mother. So
That's right.
she
Yes.
could give him children. What do we know about him as a father? I mean, this is not part of Dora's story, as you've said, she couldn't have children. I mean, that must have been a tricky relationship.
He loved the idea of children. And, you know, he encouraged his women to get pregnant. You know, he loved the idea of propagating children. But I think he was quite bored, but by the reality of having young children around, and they disturbed his work. So from what I gather, you know, Francoise was like a single parent. She did the hard work, and she had to keep, you know, the kids away from him. But I think, you know, in those moments when he did swoop in and be fatherly, he was absolutely enchanting because he could make anything out of anything. You know,
Yeah.
he could make, you know, toy cars, or he could make them freezers of, you know, dogs or dancers or whatever he wanted. So he was enchanting, but not fully present.
Well, you make an interesting point in the book, which again it hadn't occurred to me. During wartime, materials were so limited that he was using this magical ability to turn just bits of junk, really, into, you know, a minotaur, a bull, a this, a that, the other. I
Yes.
hadn't
No,
I hadn't really made that connection before.
I absolutely love that about him, that he would take, you know, a bicycle seat and handlebars and make a minotaur. You know, that the triangular seat was the face, and then he just had this knack of really turning anything to gold.
But let's we'll turn back to Dora at this point, because she's having a moment, actually, isn't she? There's been an exhibition which you alerted me to, that I went to see, of her photographs here in London, and I mean, I was blown away really by two things. One is the abstracts that she was working on, and also the fact that she just carried on working. So I think some of them are dated, you know, 1980 80. It's not like Picasso left and, she couldn't do any more work. She carried on being creative.
She worked uncompromisingly until the end of her life. And actually, Picasso steered her away from photography to painting, which I find really interesting. And I think to him, painting was the only serious art form, the only art form that mattered, and photography was like a kind of game. But she was also at the top of her profession as a photographer. So I think there was also an element of him not wanting his lover to be too independent or too successful. And right at the end of her life, she went back to photography, again, doing very, as you said, abstract and experimental work. But, she wrote her poetry, she painted, and she took photographs until she died. And she turned to religion. She said after Picasso, there can only be God. And she returned to Catholicism, which was the religion of her childhood. And she got a lot of solace through prayer and meditation. And she became increasingly solitary.
Those abstracts have a kind of numinous aura about them, and you can see she's working with shapes that resemble halos and crucifixes.
Yes.
And they're incredibly beautiful images.
They're sort of luminous, aren't they? But you're absolutely right that they reflect her growing preoccupation with religion.
And the end of the relationship with Picasso, with everything that she's been through, another painter really struck me at this point, another artist, which was Leonora Carrington, who was around at the same time. But there is a period of madness for both of them, which was what kind of connected them in my mind. The surrealism, the amazing creativity, and the whole thing about difficult men, in the background.
No, exactly. Leonora, love with Max Ernst, who really didn't treat her very well. He abandoned her during the war. And both Dora and Leonora had breakdowns.
Yeah.
And, they're both absolutely tragic and heartbreaking and very disturbing to read about. But there are so many parallels between their lives. They were both overshadowed, by these more powerful male lovers.
I think there is this sense, certainly with Leonora Carrington, the prices are rising. It's quite a long time ago now, but there was an amazing retrospective at the Serpentine that I went to, must be 20 years at least ago, and I was bowled away by her paintings. And as I've said, Dora is also having her moment. There's more interest in her now than there's ever been.
Yes.
And your book is part of that. I like to think it might have kick-started it, but maybe everything's happening at once.
So that's right. As well as the exhibition you mentioned, there's a play called Dora Maar, which is actually having its last night tonight at the Camden Fringe, but I'm quite hopeful it will come back. And there's going to be an exhibition in Paris in the autumn at the Pompidou Centre, and the theme is surrealism. So Dora's going to be part of that, and I'm going to Paris to see that no matter what. I think it's such an exciting exhibition. So she's in the air at the moment.
Yeah. Have you seen the play?
Yes, I have. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful.
So all the streams are converging, to bring her back to life.
Yeah, the play is written by Nadia Jackson, and there's a wonderful actress called Faye Ziegler who plays Dora, and she just is Dora. She just encapsulates Dora. So hopefully it will come back, and if any of your listeners see it on somewhere, do go and watch it.
Can I just talk a little bit about her as a painter? I mean, as you say, sort of, I mean, it's very curious, but I imagine Picasso thought, look, I'm the greatest painter in the world at the moment, so she wouldn't be a rival to me if she did any painting. But what was Dora's attitude? I mean, was she influenced by him in her work? How did that work?
Yes. Well, first of all, she knew she would never be as good as him. So it must have been a
Mm,
pretty daunting undertaking, but she brought this
mm,
tremendous work ethic that she had to it. But in
mm,
my view, her painting was too much in thrall to his.
mm,
And, in a way, how could she have avoided that? Um,
mm,
and she herself admitted to it. She said that in the end, she painted landscapes because that was the only way she could get away with it. Sorry, get away from him.
from
And
him, yeah.
I've seen these landscapes. They are quite magnificent. They're very grand. There's a sort of purity of line, but they lack the sort of slippage between reality and surreality that was her trademark with her photographs, that they're not as personal or as unique.
Mm, mm. I was just thinking about the book. The way that it's published is very interesting. So you have this fabulous cover, and it's got a strap line: Dora Maar and Pablo Picasso, the greatest love affair in art history. So it's interesting that it says a novel, because that almost makes it sound like, it is just the story of their affair. But I was looking on the blurb on the inside. Fictionalized retelling of the most disturbing love story in the art world. So there's sort of two different ideas there, or two complementary ideas: the greatest love affair and the most disturbing love affair. How do you think about, what do you think about the billing there that your story has been given?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's make clear it's always the publishers who come up with these strap lines. I mean, I do quite like it because it
Mm,
does grab attention, or
mm,
at least I hope it does.
mm,
And then, if you read the inside of the jacket, yes, it was incredibly disturbing.
yeah.
And then I say on page 2 of the book that Dora wants to be an artist in her own right and not a muse. And you have
Mm,
that
mm, mm,
contradiction with the title, the Paris Muse. Because of course she was his muse, and some would say she was his victim, but she was so much more than that.
mm. Well, muses are being reconfigured. I think we are still fascinated with muses, but they're becoming more complex figures than, maybe they were always more complex. Maybe just the culture said that muses were just beautiful creatures. Maybe they were always more complex.
If you go back to ancient times, the 9 muses were the goddesses of the arts, and they were Zeus's daughters.
Mm,
And they inspired poets and painters, and musicians. And if you look at the first line of the Iliad, it's "Sing, muse, sing to
yeah,
me, muse of the wrath
yeah.
of Achilles." So in other words, the artist couldn't even start his work without, the divine breath of the muses. So they were all powerful. There was nothing passive about them.
Mm,
And if you incurred their wrath, they could do you great harm. And then, of course, it was, the Renaissance. There was a huge shift, and muses were these passive objects for male artists to sort of project
mm,
onto.
mm,
But I think in the 20th century, you have muses becoming more assertive in conjunction with the rise of women's rights. You have,
mm, mm,
the Doras, who could give as good as she got with Picasso, and she influenced his work as well as
mm,
him influencing her. You have Leonora Carrington, who we've spoken about, who I believe her there was a sale at Sotheby's or one of the big, please don't hold me to that, but one of the big art fairs. And her work now fetches higher prices than Max Ernst. There was also, Camille Claudel, who was
Rodin's
Rodin.
lover, is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Rodin's lover and muse, and also an artist in her own right, also badly treated and in and out of mental institutions, unfortunately. But these muses do become much more assertive.
I'm also thinking of the pre-Raphaelites and their stunners, as they were called. And they're all such interesting women in their own right. And Lizzie Siddal actually was a painter.
Exactly. Well, the sort of irony is that Elizabeth Siddal was painted by John Everett Millais as the drowning Ophelia. But in real life, she was no passive, distressed maiden. She was an artist who deliberately chose to be an artist, model, and muse, because that way she could gain access to male artists and she could learn from them and discuss ideas with them. And there was no formal arts education open to women in her day. So she took this very practical and intelligent decision, for the sake of her own art. So the topic of muses is quite complex and nuanced.
Yes. I mean, I'm almost thinking, because the stories end so tragically in so many cases, that maybe the muses, the goddesses themselves, are hard on human muses, in a funny kind of way. There's some kind of, who do you think you are? We're the original muses. You're just a... there's just something. I think we're getting so much more interested in the topic of muses, and not just brushing them aside as pretty faces anymore. Collaboration is such a key thing as well, isn't it? Poor old Lizzie, she was lying in a bathtub, wasn't she, for days and days on end?
Exactly. And while you were talking, I also thought about male muses, male artists with male muses, like Francis Bacon, for example. And that's a whole other topic for another podcast, I think, but it's very, very interesting, this subject of muses.
Yes, an equally tragic case in the case of Bacon and his I can't remember the name of his muse, but yes. Well, we're in deep waters here with Ophelia droning away. Can I ask you what you are thinking of doing next, and will it involve strong, complex women? I imagine it will somehow.
Yes, it will. So I'm not going to tell you about it in detail, because it's still an embryo in my mind. Right. And it feels like telling people you're pregnant before you've had your 12-week scan. I feel like I'm going to jinx it somehow. But it's a venture into true crime in the 1950s. And my protagonist is a pioneer in her way. She wanted to go back to what, it's a true story. She wanted to go back to work in the 1950s and make something of her life. And this was when women were being shooed back into the home. After the increased freedoms of World War II, when they all worked and drove ambulances, and the men came home and they were like, get back in the home to their women. But this one, was determined to make something of her life. And it explores the unique pressures on her that drove her to murder.
Right. Wow.
Hopefully I'll be able to tell you much more about it before too long.
Yes. And are you deep in the research kind of element? Is this, you talked a bit earlier on about, you have this an idea that obsesses you, that it won't go away. Yes. Does that feel like this for this project.
Totally. This character is waking me up in the morning. She woke me up at 6:30 this morning. It's, bank holiday weekend. But yes, I get sort of just gripped by these women, and, they don't let go until the story is over. And even then they stay with me. I feel that Dora Maar is going to be with me for a very long time to come.
And do you, have all your books been had a basis in fact, a story that already is out there and that you flesh out? Is that your trade in a way?
Well, I find that a theme has emerged, and this is much more, by accident than design. I'm drawn to writing about strong women, groundbreaking women, who are outliers and pioneers who couldn't settle down to the roles society gave them. And they all achieved something extraordinary, but they suffered for it. And one of the things that preoccupies me a lot is that in some ways things have changed for women, and in others they haven't changed at all. I mean, you look at countries like Iran, where women are still brutally suppressed, and look closer to home, where there's still domestic and sexual violence, discrimination, lower pay. I could go on and on and on. So, I think that's why I write history. I write historical fiction, because history isn't a dry series of facts that happened a long time ago. It's a set of narratives that we relive and we keep reliving.
Yes. Well, I mean, it was funny. I was thinking about this whole thing about you being a historical novelist. And it just sort of makes me think about bustles and horse-drawn carriages, which are not bad things in any way. But this, I mean, it is a historical novel. It's a period in history, but it actually feels so vivid and alive. And
thank you, Suzi.
It feels like it's about today. I mean, my thing about the asymmetric love affair, I think, is what I'm getting at there. We haven't put this stuff to bed, put it that way.
No, exactly. And while I write, I'm very aware of the resonances between the past and the present. I mean, this is about, it's still a man's world, and, toxic relationships. And my last novel, Madwoman, was actually about Nellie Bly, America's first female investigative journalist. And to get her first big scoop, she went undercover into an asylum in order to expose the wretched conditions. But one very strong takeaway I had from writing that novel was that some of the women in the asylum were not actually mentally ill. They just didn't conform to the narrow standards of society, and they were punished for that. And, today there's still no place in history for inconvenient women.
This reminds me of Sarah Wise's recent book, which I think it's, I can't remember.
Is it The Inconvenience?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the title. I mean, I just found that fascinating because, again, it takes us up to about the 1980s, when very elderly women who had, in some cases, been locked up since they were teenagers. And
exactly.
So you have, it's just the most extraordinary story. So it's still within living memory, because you might have somebody young in 1980 who's just doing a little bit of volunteer work, and then a little old lady comes up and tells her story, and you just can hardly believe it's true. So, I mean, the story goes back, it's most of the 20th century, but it's not just women, but it's a lot of women, and it's women who have been inconvenient in some way.
Exactly. And the great irony is that, by the time they're older, they couldn't function in the real world because they've become completely institutionalized.
Exactly.
And I do, it haunts me, all of that. I do think about it a lot, and there are a lot of parallels between Sarah's book and mine. I've read it. She's wonderful.
Yeah, she's absolutely terrific. But the stories she uncovers are really heartrending, because it's sort of wasted lives and people who could have done so much.
Exactly.
One more question before I go on to my final three questions that I ask everybody. Now, you did an event recently at Hat Charts that I was at.
Yes.
It was before I'd read the novel, so it really whetted my appetite to read it. And there was a very interesting conversation to the end about Picasso and whether it's time to cancel him. You know, he was so cruel and so unfeeling to women. I mean, he'd be up there with #MeToo, wouldn't he? Really, you know, he wasn't a brute. He wasn't an abuser in that sense, but he was psychologically abusive. And that was an interesting discussion. Do we cancel Picasso?
Yeah. So that is a very interesting question, and I don't have the answer to it. So I was in conversation with Philip Hook, a former director of Sotheby's, and he made the very good but rather cynical point that we can't cancel Picasso because there's too much money in the art market.
Right.
You know, too many valuable paintings. So it's not possible to cancel Picasso. I mean, one thing that I think about is, if we cancel Picasso, where do we stop? Because there have been so many, male artists through history who have behaved terribly towards their women. I mean, it's still going on. The Me Too generation has made it much harder, but people like Picasso did it because they could get away with it. So do you cancel Rodin as well? Do you cancel this one and that one? Where do you stop?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say, when you have a figure like Rodin or Picasso, to sort of say thank you for your service. Like, they did spend their lives creating things of beauty and wonder and amazement, and that's what we now have. And in both those cases, Rodin and Picasso, they changed our world.
Yeah, it's so true.
Maybe we look at what they did rather than what they were. But like you say, it's a difficult question.
Really difficult. Maybe just accept that, they were brilliant artists who did bad things.
Yeah. And I should say, in the Paris Muse, you're very fair to Picasso. His charm comes out, his extraordinary ability, his magnetism comes out. So it's not a sort of let's dump on Picasso, let's elevate Dora, let's minimize him. That is not the story you're telling.
Thank you. What I was thinking while I was writing was that Picasso identified with the Minotaur, to whom women had to be sacrificed, which is quite chilling. But also, if you remember the legend of Theseus, the Minotaur was very complex. He was half man and half bull, so he was monstrous, but he was also born of divine punishment. He was not a one-dimensional character. And so, I don't like telling my readers what to think. I would rather they made their own minds up about whether he's a monster or whether he's a weary and damaged soul, or both. But I try to avoid straightforward categorization of him.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah, you've really succeeded in this book in kind of, I don't want to say breathing life into the characters, because they had life to begin with, but it's a very, very gripping and persuasive portrait. And I think it takes what Picasso might call some cojones to do it, to think, I am going to create a fictional portrait of Picasso particularly. So well done for that. Let's go on to my final three questions. It's I mean, it's always a hard one to ask somebody who's sort of steeped in art what their favourite artwork is, but I am going to ask you, what have you come up
So
with?
I'm deliberately not going to talk about a Picasso or a Dora Maar. I am going to talk about a painting by Howard Hodgkin that I saw in a London gallery called Menswear. And it apparently was inspired by Hodgkin looking in a shop window on a sort of rainy London night and seeing all the coloured lights, the coloured reflections. And the painting is quite abstract. You can see his form, looking in the window. But then there's this wonderful sort of array of kind of coloured swirls and lights. And it somehow evokes so beautifully that, that atmosphere of a dark London afternoon. And I'm a Londoner and I'm mad about my city, and so I'm going to choose that one. It's a really wonderful painting.
I shall have to look it up. I know the thing with Hodgkin is that the titles and the image are sort of play off against each other, don't they? There's a kind of poetic, you have to figure out what the one thing is saying to the other.
Exactly. And once you've figured it out, the titles are so apt and capture what's going on so beautifully.
Yeah, and he gives you sort of room to play in your own mind with what he's saying.
Exactly,
yeah.
Which I love that.
Yeah,
I love that in writing and in art. That sort of space for your imagination.
I haven't come across that particular painting, but I will check it out. I'll find an image somewhere. Book of shame, Louisa. Is there something that you want to confess at this point?
Yeah, this is really a terrible confession, and I'm quite embarrassed to admit to it. But James Joyce.
All of James Joyce.
All of James Joyce. I haven't read Dubliners, but I've never been able to finish the other novels.
Right. Oh, are they sort of put you off in some way, or you're bored by them? What is it?
Yeah, I've just started and just not been able to persevere.
Well, Dubliners would be quite. It's the most conventional. I guess. I think it's very early. You know what? I would say read the story in the Dubliners that is called The Dead. Because it is a masterpiece and it's quite short. It was made into a film. It's been staged. That would be my recommendation. And the last paragraph of The Dead is one of the most beautiful paragraphs in fiction you will ever read. So that's your homework, Louisa. I'm giving you homework now.
That sounds like the perfect entry point into Joyce. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
Yeah, and you need not take any further steps into Joyce land, but I would recommend.
Well, maybe it will inspire me to take those further steps. I'll let you know.
Yeah, certainly. Well, good. We've achieved something there. So you have your homework, and all it remains for me to ask is any weird, funny, bizarre feedback you've had on your work.
So the weirdest feedback, and I think I'm not alone in this because other writers have complained of similar, experiences, is when you get a 1-star review because the cover's torn when the person opens the package. And they're like, well, the book is fine, but it arrived in a terrible state, terrible condition.
Yes, you hear that quite a bit, don't you? It's sort of that the package was left on the doorstep and it got wet, or
yes,
or it didn't arrive when it was supposed to.
No, exactly. I stayed in, and it didn't come.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that people say is stay off Goodreads. I don't know whether you've heard this advice.
I follow that advice religiously, and I would pass it on to any writers. I have a friend who calls
Yeah.
it good bleeds because it's really so, it can
And
be so bitchy.
what about book reviews? Do you read your reviews? Because some writers
Um,
don't, you know.
yes, I actually try and avoid the reader reviews. I mean, I
Mm,
occasionally just can't help myself and go onto Amazon. Reads I don't
mm,
look at.
mm,
But
mm,
I think it's probably better for one's mental health to stay away from them and just to
mm,
concentrate
mm.
on making the next book the best one you can, which is the only thing that's in your control as a writer.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very good advice anyway, once you've finished one book, to have something else to work on, because
Totally.
there's the time lag. You send the book in. I mean, that must be quite a weird thing when you've
Mm.
delivered one baby, as it were.
No,
And
exactly, and
yeah.
it leaves this massive hole in your life as well. I never
Mm,
know quite what to do with myself when I send a book out into the world. And you're absolutely right. The best thing is to start writing something else.
mm, mm. Yes. The other thing you can't ever ask a writer is, do you have a favorite among your novels? Because
Mm.
I remember, I can't remember actually who it was, but somebody once said to me, it's a bit like being asked who your favorite child is. You know, you
And
love
we
all of
probably have
them.
a view. We have a view, but we can't say it.
We can't possibly say it. Yes, maybe that's right. Um, okay, so we have been talking about the Paris Muse, wonderful, wonderful novel. Takes you deep into the heart of the 30s, the 40s, the wartime, um, the romance of two extraordinary people, and it can make you sort of feel rather relieved that one is not currently in the throes of a relationship with a genius. Um, so thank you very much for joining me in the book bag. Can't wait to hear about the next one once you've had all the scans and maybe safely delivered it, but I hope you'll come back then.
Susie, thank you so much for having me. I had a great time and I would love to come back. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Goodbye, Louisa, and I hope to see you soon. So, yeah, a huge thank you to Louisa Treger, and hope you enjoyed hearing us chat about all the different themes in her book, The Paris Muse, out now from Bloomsbury. Highly recommended. Join me next time when I will bring another fascinating author to your interest. In the meantime, goodbye.